From humble militias to the world's most powerful force, the U.S. Army's journey is one of courage, evolution, and sacrifice. But how did it all begin? Let's uncover the epic story behind America's military rise. Before there was a United States, there were 13 colonies. These colonies belonged to Great Britain, a powerful empire across the Atlantic Ocean. The people living in the colonies started to feel that the king and his government were not treating them fairly. They were asked to pay taxes, but they had no voice in the government that made those laws. This idea of taxation without representation made many colonists very angry. They wanted the same rights as people living in England. They wanted to be free to make their own choices and govern themselves in their own land. This growing feeling of discontent was like a slow-burning fire, just waiting for a spark to ignite a revolution. The colonists were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and teachers. They lived ordinary lives, working their land and raising their families. But as tensions with Great Britain grew, they knew they might have to fight for their freedom. They started to form small groups called militias. These were local men who would gather to train with their own muskets. They were not a professional army. They were citizen soldiers ready to defend their homes and their neighbors at a moment's notice. This was the very beginning of the idea of an American army, an army made up of the people themselves, fighting for a cause they deeply believed in. The spark finally came on a spring day in 1775. British soldiers, known as Redcoats because of their bright uniforms, marched from Boston to the towns of Lexington and Concord. They were sent to seize weapons and ammunition that the colonists had stored. But the colonists were watching. Riders like Paul Revere galloped through the night, warning everyone that the British were coming. When the Redcoats arrived in Lexington, a small group of militiamen stood waiting on the town green. A shot was fired. No one knows for sure who fired it, but it was the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun, and the need for a real army became urgent. In response to the fighting, leaders from the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. They knew that small, separate militias were not enough to fight the mighty British Army. They needed a single, unified force to stand against the empire. So, on June 14, 1775, they made a historic decision. They voted to create the Continental Army. This was the official birth of the United States Army. They chose a tall, respected Virginian planter to lead it. His name was George Washington. He was given the monumental task of turning a ragtag collection of farmers and shopkeepers into an army capable of winning a nation's independence. The new Continental Army faced an enormous challenge. The British Army was the most powerful and professional fighting force in the world at that time. Its soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, and well-fed. In contrast, the American soldiers were often poorly supplied. They lacked everything from guns and gunpowder to shoes and warm clothing. They were volunteers who had left their farms and families to fight for the idea of liberty. Their spirit was strong, but their resources were very limited. General George Washington's first task was not just to fight battles, but to hold this fragile army together through sheer will and determination. He had to inspire them to keep fighting, even when everything seemed lost. The early years of the war were incredibly difficult for the Continental Army. They suffered many defeats. The British captured major cities like New York and Philadelphia. But Washington knew he did not have to win every battle. He just had to keep the army in the field and avoid a catastrophic defeat. He showed his brilliance with surprise attacks. On Christmas night in 1776, he led his freezing soldiers across the icy Delaware River. They surprised and defeated a force of Hessian mercenaries in the Battle of Trenton. This small victory was a huge boost for American morale. It showed that the Continental Army could fight and win against professional soldiers. One of the hardest times for the Army was the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. It was not a battle, but a struggle for survival. The soldiers were starving and freezing. They lived in crude log huts they built themselves. Many died from disease, hunger, and the bitter cold. Yet they endured. A former Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and transformed the army. He did not speak much English, but he taught the soldiers how to drill, how to march, and how to use their bayonets effectively. He turned the exhausted volunteers into a disciplined fighting force, ready to face the British on more equal terms. The turning point of the war came with the help of an important ally, France. The French, longtime rivals of the British, decided to support the American cause after the colonists' victory at the Battle of Saratoga. They sent money, ships, and soldiers. This international support was crucial. The final major battle took place at Yorktown, Virginia, in 1881. General Washington, with the help of French troops and the French Navy, trapped a large British army led by General Cornwallis. The French fleet blocked the British from escaping by sea, while the American and French armies laid siege to them on land. Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended the war and secured America's independence. For many years after the Revolution, the United States grew and changed, but a deep and terrible division was growing within the country. The division was over the issue of slavery. The southern states had economies that depended on the labor of enslaved African Americans. The northern states had largely abolished slavery and were becoming more industrial. The disagreement became so strong that it threatened to tear the nation apart. In 1861, 11 southern states decided to leave the United States and form their own country, called the Confederate States of America. The president, Abraham Lincoln, declared that the Union must be preserved. The conflict that followed was the American Civil War. The war pitted brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor. The United States Army, now often called the Union Army, fought to bring the southern states back into the nation. The Confederate Army fought for its independence. The war was fought with a ferocity never before seen on American soil. New technologies like rifled muskets and improved cannons made battles far deadlier than in the past. Soldiers on both sides showed incredible bravery, fighting for the causes they believed in. The Civil War was a defining moment for the U.S. Army, testing its strength and its soul in a conflict that would determine the very future of the country. One of the most important battles of the war was fought in a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. In July 1863, the Union Army, led by General George Meade, clashed with the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee. The battle lasted for 3 brutal days. It involved over 160,000 soldiers. The fighting was intense, with famous moments like the defense of Little Round Top and the disastrous Confederate charge known as Pickett's Charge. The Union Army held its ground and won a decisive victory. The Battle of Gettysburg was a major turning point. It stopped the Confederate invasion of the North and put the Union on the path to ultimate victory. The Union had many great leaders, but perhaps the most effective was General Ulysses S. Grant. He was a quiet, determined man who understood that winning the war required relentless pressure on the Confederate armies. Unlike other generals who were often too cautious, Grant was willing to fight hard and keep moving forward, even after suffering heavy losses. President Lincoln trusted him completely, finally finding a general who would fight. Grant's strategy was to wear down the Confederacy until it could no longer resist. In April 1865, his strategy paid off when he forced the surrender of General Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War and reuniting the nation. As the United States entered the 20th century, the world was changing rapidly. The U.S. Army had fought in smaller conflicts like the Spanish-American War, but it was still a relatively small professional force. Meanwhile, in Europe, tensions were rising between powerful empires. A complex web of alliances meant that a small conflict could quickly explode into a massive war. In 1914, that is exactly what happened. The assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction, pulling nation after nation into what would become known as World War I, or the Great War. For the first few years, the United States remained neutral, watching the terrible conflict from afar. The war in Europe was unlike any fought before. It was a brutal war of attrition, fought from long, muddy trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. Millions of soldiers died in massive assaults that gained only a few yards of ground. New and terrible weapons were introduced, such as machine guns, poison gas, and armored tanks. The scale of the death and destruction was horrifying. President Woodrow Wilson tried to keep America out of the conflict, but German actions made that impossible. Germany began sinking American ships with its submarines, and it tried to get Mexico to attack the United States. In April 1917, America could no longer stand by. Congress declared war on Germany. The U.S. Army was not ready for a war of this size. It had to grow incredibly fast. The government passed the Selective Service Act, which required millions of young men to register for the draft. The Army swelled from a small force to an army of millions in a very short time. These new soldiers, nicknamed doughboys, were sent to training camps all across the country. They learned how to handle rifles, dig trenches, and wear gas masks. Then they boarded ships and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to join the fight in France. Their arrival gave a much-needed boost to the exhausted British and French armies. The energy and sheer numbers of the American expeditionary forces made a critical difference. American soldiers fought with great courage in several key battles on the Western Front. One of the most significant was the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the fall of 1918. It was the largest and deadliest battle in American history up to that point. Over 1 million American soldiers took part, pushing through the dense Argonne forest against fierce German resistance. The fighting was difficult and the casualties were high, but the doughboys pressed forward. Their relentless attack helped to break the German lines and convince the German high command that the war was lost. On November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed and the guns finally fell silent. The U.S. Army had helped to end the Great War. Just 2 decades after the end of World War I, the world was once again on the brink of war. In Europe, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party rose to power in Germany. In Asia, the Empire of Japan was expanding aggressively. These aggressive powers threatened the peace and freedom of the entire world. For a time, America again tried to stay neutral. Most folks remembered the horrors of the last war and, honestly, did not want to get involved in another one. But the country began to prepare. The army started to build up its strength, developing new tanks, planes, and weapons. It was a time of watching and waiting as the storm clouds of war gathered across the oceans. The waiting ended on December 7, 1941. On that Sunday morning, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was devastating, sinking battleships and killing thousands of American sailors and soldiers. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan, and a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fully engaged in World War II, a global conflict on an epic scale. The nation mobilized for war as never before. Factories stopped making cars and started making tanks, and millions of men and women joined the armed forces, including the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army fought in 2 main theaters of war, Europe and the Pacific. In Europe, the Army worked with its allies, Great Britain and the Soviet Union, to defeat Nazi Germany. American soldiers, known as GIs, fought their way across North Africa and then up through Italy. The most famous operation was D-Day on June 6, 1944. On that day, the largest amphibious invasion in history took place. American, British, and Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, under intense German fire. It was a brutal and bloody day, especially on Omaha Beach, but the soldiers secured a foothold. This was the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire in Europe. From Normandy, the Allied armies pushed east, liberating France and battling their way into Germany itself. They fought major battles like the Battle of the Bulge, a desperate German counterattack in the winter of 1944. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the army was engaged in a brutal campaign of island hopping against Japan. Soldiers and Marines fought on jungle-covered islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Okinawa. The fighting was savage and cost many lives. Finally, in August 1945, after the use of 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The U.S. Army had played a central role in defeating tyranny and saving the world for democracy. After the victory of World War II, the world did not find lasting peace. Instead, a new kind of conflict began. It was called the Cold War. This was a long and tense struggle between the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its communist allies. It was cold because the two superpowers never fought each other directly in a major war. They were both armed with nuclear weapons, and a direct conflict would have been catastrophic for the entire planet. So instead, they competed for influence around the globe. The U.S. Army's role changed, y'all. It had to be ready to fight anywhere in the world at a moment's notice to contain the spread of communism. The Cold War sometimes turned hot in smaller conflicts. The first major test for the U.S. Army came in 1950 when Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States and other United Nations countries sent troops to defend South Korea. The Korean War was a brutal conflict, fought in rugged, mountainous terrain and extreme weather. Soldiers faced freezing winters and hot, humid summers. The war saw bitter fighting, including a daring amphibious landing at Incheon and a massive intervention by Chinese forces. After 3 years of intense combat, the war ended in a stalemate, with the country remaining divided. The war showed that the Army had to be prepared for limited wars, not just all-out global conflicts. A decade later, the Army was drawn into another long and difficult war, this time in Vietnam. The goal was to support the government of South Vietnam against communist forces from North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The Vietnam War was a war with no clear front lines. Soldiers fought a determined enemy in dense jungles, swamps, and rice paddies. Helicopters became a vital tool, used to move troops, supply them, and evacuate the wounded. The war was deeply controversial back home in the United States. Many people protested against it. For the soldiers in Vietnam, it was a confusing and frustrating conflict. After many years of fighting and heavy casualties, American troops were withdrawn in 1973. The end of the Cold War came in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. This dramatically changed the world and the Army's mission once again. A new era began. The Army demonstrated its power and modern capabilities in the Persian Gulf War in 1991, quickly liberating Kuwait from an Iraqi invasion. But the 21st century brought new challenges. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Army was sent to Afghanistan and Iraq to fight a new kind of enemy terrorist networks. These long wars in the Middle East have defined the Army for a new generation of soldiers, requiring them to be not just warriors, but also peacekeepers, trainers, and nation builders. Life for a soldier in the United States Army today is very different from the past, yet some things remain the same. The core values of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage are still the foundation of everything a soldier does. Today's Army is an all-volunteer force. Every soldier has made a personal choice to serve their country. They come from all 50 states and from every background imaginable. They are men and women who have decided to take on the immense responsibility of being an American soldier. Their journey begins with basic combat training, where they are transformed from civilians into disciplined members of a team. The modern soldier is a highly skilled professional. The Army is no longer just about infantrymen with rifles. Today's Army has over 150 different jobs or military occupational specialties. A soldier might be a helicopter pilot, a cybersecurity expert, a combat medic, an engineer, a mechanic, or a satellite communications specialist. Technology is a huge part of the modern Army. Soldiers use advanced equipment like night vision goggles, GPS devices, sophisticated radios, and highly advanced weapon systems. They are trained constantly to be experts in their fields and to work together as a cohesive unit, whether that unit is a small fire team or a large brigade. The life of a soldier involves frequent moves and deployments. Soldiers and their families may live on Army bases, called posts, all over the United States and in other countries like Germany, South Korea, or Italy. This global presence is a key part of the Army's mission. Deployments are a major part of a soldier's career. A deployment means being sent away from home to a place like the Middle East, Europe, or Asia to conduct a mission. These deployments can last for many months and are very challenging for both the soldiers and their families. They require great resilience and sacrifice. The Army provides strong support systems for families to help them through these difficult times. The bond between soldiers is one of the most powerful aspects of Army life. Soldiers train together, live together, fight together, and rely on each other for their very survival. This shared experience creates a sense of camaraderie and trust that is difficult to find anywhere else. They call it brotherhood and sisterhood. This bond helps them get through the toughest challenges, from the rigors of training to the dangers of combat. It is a bond that lasts a lifetime. Even after they leave the service, veterans often feel a deep connection to the Army and to those with whom they served. This powerful human element is the true strength of the United States Army. Throughout its long history, the United States Army has been shaped by its leaders. These are the men and women who have guided soldiers in times of peace and war, who have made difficult decisions on the battlefield, and who have inspired their troops to achieve victory against all odds. The very first and perhaps most important leader was General George Washington. He was more than just a general. He was the symbol of the American Revolution. He held the Continental Army together through starvation and defeat. His leadership, persistence, and strategic vision were the glue that kept the fight for independence alive, ultimately leading to the birth of a new nation. In the crucible of the Civil War, another great leader emerged, Ulysses S. Grant. Many other Union generals had been hesitant or were defeated by the brilliant Confederate general Robert E. Lee. But Grant was different. He was a relentless and pragmatic commander who understood the brutal arithmetic of war. He knew that the Union's advantages in men and material could win the war if applied with constant pressure. His overland campaign was bloody, but it wore down Lee's army and led to the final victory. Grant's determination to see the war through to the end was essential to preserving the United States as a single, undivided nation. In the 20th century, the Army produced leaders who had to command on a global scale. General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. He insisted that American soldiers fight together under American command, which helped forge a distinct and powerful American fighting force on the Western Front. Later, in World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower held the title of Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He was responsible for commanding millions of soldiers from different nations. His greatest achievement was overseeing the D-Day invasion of Normandy, a massively complex operation that required incredible planning and diplomatic skill. Another giant of World War II was General George C. Marshall. He never led troops in combat during the war. Instead, he served as the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C. He was the architect of the American victory. He was a brilliant organizer who was responsible for raising, training, and equipping an army of millions of soldiers and sending them to fight all over the world. After the war, he became Secretary of State and created the Marshall Plan, which helped to rebuild Europe and prevent the spread of communism. His career shows that leadership in the Army is not just about battlefield command, but also about strategy, organization, and vision. These leaders, and countless others, built the Army into what it is today. Today, on October 6, 2025, the United States Army stands as the nation's primary land force, a powerful and versatile tool for protecting American interests at home and abroad. Its mission is complex and ever-changing. The Army is no longer just focused on fighting large-scale wars between nations. It must also be prepared to counter terrorism, respond to cyber attacks, and provide humanitarian aid after natural disasters. Soldiers might find themselves training Allied forces in one country, conducting peacekeeping operations in another, or helping American citizens recover from a hurricane or wildfire. This wide range of missions requires a force that is adaptable, highly trained, and always ready to respond. The Army's importance to national security cannot be overstated. It is a visible symbol of American power and commitment around the world. The presence of Army troops in places like Europe and Asia helps to reassure our allies and deter potential adversaries. By being forward deployed, the Army can respond quickly to crises before they escalate into larger conflicts. It is a force designed to prevent war just as much as it is designed to win one. The soldiers, the tanks, the helicopters, and the advanced technology all serve one primary purpose: to protect the United States, its people, and its way of life from all threats. From its humble beginnings as the Continental Army, a small group of defiant colonists, the U.S. Army has traveled an epic journey. It has fought to create a nation, to preserve it from division, and to defend it from global tyranny. It has adapted from an army of muskets and cannons to a high-tech force capable of operating anywhere on Earth. Through it all, the one constant has been the American soldier. The farmer, the shopkeeper, the teacher, the mechanic, the computer scientist, all ordinary citizens who have answered the call to do something extraordinary. They have shown courage in the face of fear and have sacrificed for a cause larger than themselves. The story of the United States Army is in many ways the story of America itself. It is a story of struggle, sacrifice, and growth. It is a story of adapting to new challenges and overcoming incredible odds. It is a story written in the mud of Valley Forge, on the bloody fields of Gettysburg, on the beaches of Normandy, and in the deserts of the Middle East. The Army is more than just a branch of the military, it is a national institution. It represents an enduring promise to the American people that as long as the nation needs defending, the United States Army will be always ready and always there.